Hare Krishna and Jai Prabhupada. The lecture or the presentation that I want to give is the same presentation that I gave for the University of Delhi in India last year. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad invokes a synthesis of concepts, thus building on the metaphysical world of the Vedic Yajna. The Brahmanical models of eschatology, metaphysics, ontology, and theology, and the rest grows directly from the mechanisms of the Yajna. The image of the yearling calf, or the Samvatsara, seems to be an attempt to relate the duration of a rite with its sacrificial beast, its sacrificial victim. We see this sort of identification through Vedic ritual. By identifying time with the year, for example, time evolved one of its earliest synthetic forms. Mortality became incorporated into the very substance of time. We hear in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad was death, about a narrative about death, in which it is stated that death was hungry, and so he took a second form as the year. This sort of use, this double use of time, this double sort of play of time, time as mortality, time as duration, shows us that the concepts of death, the concepts of life, and the concepts of time are all deeply intertwined and intrinsically related. Now, Vishnu is also identified not just with time, as in the Bhagavad Gita, Kalusmi Lokakshaya Krit Samrita, but also with the Yajna itself. And he is also identified, by the way, this identification of Yajna by Vishnu is made many times throughout the Vedas. There's a book by Jan Gonda called Prajapati in the Year, in which he discusses some of the rather extensive citations used to identify Vishnu or Prajapati with the year and the various identifications of the year in this early period. So Vishnu is the Yajna. Vishnu is also the Paramam, which is stated in the beginning of the Aitareya Brahmana, the topmost. Vishnu is Kutastha, literally situated at the pinnacle or at the peak, as in the Bhagavad Gita. And we also have Vishnu as Trivikrama, who takes 3 wide steps, wide strides, and in so achieves the highest. So these are all very interesting and interrelated sort of passages from the Vedas and the later texts, which we want to sort of draw a sort of picture, connecting the dots between these various statements. First of all, we have this narrative in Uttanapada, Uttama, and Dhruva, who are all connected with the Paramam Padam in the Bhagavata Purana's 4th canto, chapters 8 and 9. Now, of course, we know the famous Param Padam, Om Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam Sada Pasyanti Suryaha. All the gods are always able to see that ever visible highest station of Vishnu. But where is this Paramam Padam located in the visible sky? If it's always visible to the gods, would that mean it's also always visible to us as humans? Or is it sometimes visible to us, sometimes invisible? That's a good question that I think we ought to ask. You know, we can take clues from these other passages that we've come across, such as the Om Agnir Vai Devanam Avamo Vishnu Paramaha. That's the Aitareya Brahmana 111, which states Om Agni indeed is of all the gods is the lowest, Vishnu is the highest. And it turns out that there's reason to suppose that this hymn may be astronomical in its sort of orientation, and I'll give you a little bit of a sense of why I think so. A.B. Keith dates the Aitareya Brahmana to the period of 600 BCE, or approximately thereof, and he pointing out that it mentions Punar Mrityu, this kind of early notion of proto-metempsychosis, or the early concept of reincarnation, an early version of that. He's identifying it with the period of the Buddha, in which reincarnation was, according to many South Asian scholars, becoming a prominent sort of thought, and beginning to develop into a more full and robust idea as people were beginning to imagine death and rebirth in more philosophically abstracted terms. There is, around 600 BCE, there is a constellation in the southern hemisphere of the sky known as Ara, which is the altar of fire. And it was, at the time of 600 BC, from the vantage point of India, it would have been visible just above the southern hemisphere. Even in North India, you would have been able to see it just above the southern horizon. Now, if we regard the south as down and the north as up, which there's reason to use that sort of thing, that sort of model of direction, then we can also begin to understand or appreciate that this sort of modeling allows for there to be an upwards deity of Vishnu, a northern Vishnu, a Vishnu in the north, so to speak. Now, we do know that Uttama and Uttara are related. Uttara meaning up more, but also having that concept of north. It also covers the concept of north. And so when you go north in India, at least according to this ancient cosmology, you're not merely going along the ground flatly, you're also going upwards, you're ascending. And so this is a very important part of understanding how the sky could have this position of Paramam or Uttamam as the Kutastha, where the North Pole resides, or rather where the North Star resides. The Kutastha, or the Udasinavat, is very interesting in itself. Kuta, of course, means like a mountain peak, but it also, in many different sort of structures, we see that Vishnu represents something which is stable or not moving. Udasinavad, asinam, as the Bhagavad Gita states, I am seated as though neutral, seated above this all, to use various translations that have been used for that verse. But in the Udasinavat, to be seated at the pinnacle of the world, and to be seated in such a way that you're still or motionless. It is also reified in the sort of tension that exists, for example, between Kalanemi, a name for Kamsa in his prior life. So having Vishnu put at odds with Kalanemi or Kamsa is also again clearly signaling this sort of relationship between the center of the wheel, the unmoving part, the axis, and the parts which move. The timeless one who is eternal, but also in a sense at the hub of time. So this is a very interesting and important sort of feature, again, to take note of in trying to understand this sort of astronomical reading of the various narrative elements of Vishnu. That leads us to some other very interesting, very interesting issues. Delhi is located at 28 degrees of northern latitude. Vrindavan, coincidentally, is situated at 30 degrees of northern latitude, which makes it an ideal place if you wanted to use regular astronomical instruments by virtue of a stable North Star in order to segment the sky up into 30-degree segments. And that would, of course, be possible by simply looking in the northern horizon or looking in the direction of the North Star, and then measuring from the North Star to the ground using something like, say, a piece of twine or string, say an upavit, a Brahmin's thread. And then you would be able to use that to then segment the sky into 30-degree segments, and that could be cut in half again for 15 degrees, cut in half again for 7.5, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. The upavit, having been composed of two intertwined strands, in fact allows for almost a slide rule sort of function. And there are other passages from the later Vedas. One passage that glorifies the guru who takes the disciple upon his lap for 2 or 3 nights and teaches him the Brahman, the riddles. And of course this would be very appropriate if you were putting the child in your lap and teaching him how to use the slide rule in order to measure out the stars overhead. You'd have a natural alignment so you could see the things from the same point of view. So all of that does sort of add to the weight of this particular thesis that much of the early narrative in the Veda is in fact intended to reflect a kind of astronomical lore or a kind of description of constellations and stars and their relationships. So again, with Kurukshetra being at 30 degrees of northern latitude, it is in fact an ideal place for doing astronomical observation. Given that we have established, or at least offered, some sort of rational basis, some kind of phenomenal basis for suggesting that there is a relationship between Vishnu and astronomy, we can then begin to analyze that in more detail. Vishnu Rupa, the Vishnu Rupa is very interesting, particularly when we take into account the Oriyan deities of Jagannath, Baladeva and Subhadra. These 3 deities have abstract forms, right? Vishnu has something of an upside down trapezoid. Subhadra's face is often flat and roundish, and Baladeva's face is sometimes pentagonal. And now this is not, how do you say, there are not strict rules here. We do see many variants of these particular deities. Sometimes, Jagannath's jaw is very roundish and more like Subhadra's and Baladev's than that kind of trapezoidal squareness. But at times it is at least evident that there are moments when, or there are instances of the deity where Jagannath has a very trapezoidal face, and so when we compare that to the 3 constellations, Hercules, which has that trapezoidal form as part of the torso, when we have the octagonal form or the jawline of Subhadra, and then we have the pentagonal form of Boötes, which is also, if you look at the larger structure, shaped like a conch shell. In that respect, we could argue that the conch shell is Boötes, and the spherical form of Subhadra is also the wheel of Vishnu. One more point about this, and this connects directly to the last point I was making about Vishnu as the Kutastha. Around the year 6500 BCE, Tau Hercules, the knee of Vishnu, or the knee of Hercules at least, was the pole star. Now, this is important because we see in the iconography that the knee of Hercules would also be the foot of a midget. That is to say, because the legs are short. If we imagine the Tau Hercules not as a knee, but as a dwarf's foot, then it would be in fact the highest step, the Uttamapada of Vishnu, as Trivikrama or Vamana. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Hanuman's iconography is another important part of the puzzle, because Hanuman has a sort of iconic form which very much resembles Vishnu, and there are other astronomical elements from various traditions ranging from Greece to Mesopotamia to China and then India, of course, which do seem to pose some sort of ancient correlations between the Hanuman, the iconography of Hanuman and the constellations which I have just mentioned of Hercules, Corona Borealis, and Boötes. In particular, the Chinese have an alternate name for the Corona Borealis constellation, which could, in the case of the narrative be associated with the broken jaw. It does look like a dislocated jaw in some respects. Now, aside from that, however, the Chinese refer to it as a pair of coiled thongs, that is to say, a pair of copings. Or his mother was said to have swallowed the copings as a young, when she was pregnant with him, and so he came out with a pair of copings on, and that made him a lifelong celibate. This is a very complicated riddle, so to speak, and we need to suss out some of the details here to appreciate what's going on, what kind of play is going on. What we see in at least the iconography here with Hercules when he is slaying the Hydra in this ancient painting from Europe, and this drawing of Hanuman as when he's carrying the mountain of medicinal herbs to save Lakshmana and Ram's army. We see very similar positions. The club is in the right hand. The hand is holding up a large the left hand of Hanuman is holding up a large mountain, and the left knee is bent and raised, and in both cases this is the case. Now Hercules in this painting is recapitulating again astronomy, as there is in fact a large constellation just beneath Hercules' foot, known as Draconis, the multi-headed dragon or the Hydra. And of course that relates again to Krishna's play in Kaliya Damana, the chastiser of Kaliya. So again, we have multiple layers of narrative motif being mapped on top of each other. And of course, Hanuman himself is carrying a large mountain, which I have reason to believe, and without going into much detail about this, that this is the great constellation of Ophiuchus, which is in some cases known as the medicinal man. And then again, and also perhaps associated again with the Mount Sumeru in the churning of the milk ocean. So in multiple different ways, we can map and correlate these constellations together using narratives as our sort of our hermeneutical guides. So all of those correlations do again provide strong evidence for the connection between Hanuman, whose tail could be Corona Borealis, and Hercules, and again Vishnu. Now we also know, those of us who've studied the narrative of Ramanujacharya know of the heresy of the Chandogya Upanishad, in which Ramanuja's teacher compared the lotus eyes of Vishnu to a monkey's seat. Now that would seem heretical to a traditional reading if we did not understand what was being said there as well. Kapyasana is of course the phrase, the term that's being interpreted or translated, but in fact what we actually see is that this is probably just talking about the monkey's tail, and asana, of course, here just being just in the same way that in Bengali one says foot, or leg, both with the same phrase pa. So in the same way, it may be that the asana refers not just to the derriere, but also to the tail. And so that would help us to understand it, and particularly the fact that the lotus eye has been compared, because in fact the shape again is perhaps that of the cavity of the eye, or the closed eye. I want to make one more point about Jagannath, Baladeva, and Subhadra. If there is some kind of external influence which helped to form the Sanskrit of the Vedas that came from outside of India, nevertheless some of the iconography may well have originated within India all the same. And I think with Jagannath, Baladeva, and Subhadra, there are arguments for this. Some scholars have argued that they were originally of Mauryan influence, that is to say East Indian, pre-Aryan religious types. And so it would not be a problem for the Vedas to have been composed later, yet built upon indigenous narratives which go back even further. As I've said, this pole star narrative seems to point to a time, if not be to have been originated in that time, at least to point to the time of somewhere around 7600 BC. I don't know why I thought 6500. That's completely wrong. 7600 BCE was the time. But there's also the question of other shapes, other forms that are prominent within the Vaishnava tradition and which are associated with that same trapezoidal form, the Ramanujite and Sri Vaishnav Tilak, for example, is also, it has that sort of trapezoidal form. So again, that may be something which has an origin within that ancient constellation. Now, there are other points about Boötes and that I'd like to make at this time. For one thing, the Greeks regarded the constellation Ursa Major, the big bear, as an art plow. They regarded it as a plow, very much the same type of plow which Balaram would have been reputed to carry. And it turns out that the arm, or what would be the tail of the Ursa Major, does connect to the raised left arm, if he's facing us, the raised left arm of Boötes, who is those three stars which constitute that left arm are associated with three asses, which again in the Arabic tradition of astronomical lore would be then again associated with Dhenukasura. And then again, there's also within the constellation of Boötes a constellation among the Arabic astronomers called the Gopa, or the cowherd. So in various ways, and of course Boötes in the Greek tradition is the cousin brother of Hercules. So the association is clearly not merely an accident. There's very much an intentional connection here. So let's move back forward to the Kalosmi quote. So the shloka from the Gita reflects a kind of matured theology. Krishna's identity with time is an important development in the thinking of the Vedas. Time is the support of all constellations. Just as the year encompasses or embodies all of the 12 major constellations, or which may again be associated with the 12 Adityas. But then again, time as a greater abstraction encompasses all years. And so time is a form of abstraction when we think of it moving from this sort of astrological lore of deities that are in prominence in various times of year, such as the worship of Durga during the fall when Virgo is in alignment with the sun and the moon. Or the coming of the rainy season, as when Taurus, the bull, is the ruddy one, the ruddy bull comes into prominence in alignment with this power of the sun. Then the rains come. So these kinds of Vedic narratives do tend to play very strongly on astronomical motifs, and in return this does suggest something about Vishnu himself. The seasonal deities remain fixed within the calendrical cycles of the year, but Vishnu, once upon a time, seemed to transcend all of that. He was as if a permanent installation of the northern sky, a deity who never set below the horizon, fixed for all time, de facto eternal. It has not been seen really since that early period of 6800 BCE, implying that the tradition behind the image of Vishnu as Parampadam may in fact be nearly 9,000 years old. A truly ancient narrative, if not one that has survived in its original language. Now, according to Western historians, the axial precession was not discovered until Hipparchus, around the period of 190 to 120 BCE, approximately 200 years before the time of Christ. Now, we could suppose that the North Star is the highest heaven, that is intended to be the highest heaven. And of course, with the Dhruva narrative, there's reason to believe that. The pole star, or the Dhruva, literally the fixed star, is in fact a Vaikuntha planet, according to the Bhagavatam's own narrative structure. So this would suggest that in fact there are these other heavens could be found in the various quarters of the sky. For instance, Brahmaloka could be associated with the constellation Cygnus, again in the locale of Hercules, very high in the sky, and again, even in an even ancient time, older time, if we want to suppose that during Satya Yuga, this might have been Sadr, the heart of the swan, might have been calculated as the former pole star. And so the heart of the swan, Sadr, by the way, is a Sindhi word. It comes from South Pakistan in the region of India. So that star's name does in fact originate very close to India and probably had a lot of Indian influence. So what I really want to point to is that the age of the Rig Veda is an age of astronomy, and that astronomy in the first and 10th mandalas of the Rig Veda is becoming a serious issue. The hymn of Dirgha Tamas, who's clearly devoted to Vishnu, is asking questions such as, who can tell me how many wheels this world has, how many chakras there are in this world? Who can tell me the form of time? And so chakras, I think, in this abstract sort of debate, do really have to do with the cycles of planets, the sort of cycles of the various celestial bodies. And that is really where we would have some of our earliest sort of notions of time as a wheel or time as Vishnu's chakra coming from. Finally, I've done much more extensive sort of versions of this, and you can find all of that at my blog, Vishnu's Wheel of Time. If you are interested, feel free to come and visit the blog. There's plenty there. I've gone into great detail on many of these points. Finally, I just want to say thank you very much for listening attentively, and I would just ask that you please give this thought a great deal of consideration, and do your own work on this, do your own research on this, and see what you can find. I don't want to say that this explains everything, but there is something here. There's a substantial amount of insight that can be gleaned from taking this particular approach to Bhagavata scripture, and there's much more work to be done on this particular theme and these particular kinds of issues. Anyways, thank you very much. Hare Krishna, Jai Srila Prabhupada.